Yeah, so basically I'm introducing a new project which we're about to start. The contracting was all signed and sealed last week, so we can't get much newer than that. So luckily it was done, otherwise I wasn't allowed to come and talk to you, so that would have made it interesting for the day. So if any of you saw the RFP or were, I guess, behind the conversations that led to this call for this project to be done, the RFP really was around developing a tool for measuring carbohydrates status in avocado orchards and some of the management options and so on that might make use of that tool. So in the end, the project that we've contracted is the first stage of that. So we're basically doing a proof of concept around the tool primarily for a shorter 2-year project. And if that's successful, then obviously we'll look to a larger project and commercialization. So first of all, I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we're on here at Stuarts Point today, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. So the talk Harley just gave us, he put in a couple of hypotheses around, how carbohydrate status is potentially important. Firstly, around the intensity of flowering and the impact that has. And then secondly, around where you have vegetative flushes through the season and the impact of those, particularly in spring in terms of the fruit set and in summer in terms of fruit abscission events. So what this work that Harley's done and past work before that Harley and his lab have done sort of led to the idea that we, growers really wanted to be able to measure the carbohydrate status of their trees and develop management protocols to optimize that, to minimize these impacts that affect productivity and yield variability. And so the call for this project, which is AV 24008, came out of that, and that's covered by levy funds. So as I said, we're basically doing a 2-year proof of concept first of all. So the objectives of this project is to continue some of the work around understanding how carbohydrate dynamics interact with phenology, fruit development, crop load, and yield consistency. So we'll continue that work, but the biggest focus is more on the methodology. So first of all, we have to come up with a manual methodology for the sort of wet lab analysis of carbohydrates, tree status, to determine exactly what that is and how best to measure it to work as the ground truth and information for a higher tech solution. Oh, looks like we've got some formatting shifted as well. So the bulk of the project is really to develop a validated method to assess tree carbohydrates at scale, which we intend to do through the UAV. So if we think about, having a field method, so we need an in-field method. We don't want to be going and taking samples, sending them off to the lab and getting data back at some point in the future. We want information reasonably quickly. We want it at scale in field. There's a number of constraints about that. So the first one is exactly what do we mean by carbohydrate status? As Harley sort of talked about, carbohydrates produced via the canopy, and then we've got reserves in various parts of the plant. Exactly where is the fruit being fed from? Typically, fruit are most commonly getting most of their energy inputs, their carbohydrates, from quite close to them physically within the tree. And so I guess our default view is the combination of these things is that if we can assess basically the whole canopy of the tree, that is very likely to be representative of the true carbohydrate status of that tree. We are going to be looking at all of the parts of the tree and assessing where the carbohydrates are and how they shift with phenology over time to prove that or not that our view is correct. And we do have flexibility in terms of how we develop and apply the project work, if things are not exactly as we expect. So the second difficulty in terms of coming up with a method to look at carbohydrates is, how are we going to measure this whole pool? So we're talking about an entire tree, potentially, the whole tree is affecting the fruit there. It's not really very practical to chop down large numbers of trees and physically measure the carbohydrates in all of those. So again, we have to have a method, some methods to do the ground truth data around this but are representative of the tree. And thirdly, in terms of like a grower-facing tool, the method's got to give a timely result, and it's got to have accuracy. It doesn't necessarily have to have perfect accuracy, but it has to have accuracy adequate to enable effective management decisions. And so, to do this, really, we think it's got to be an in-field measure, and really it wants to be on the go. You don't want to be going and walking around hundreds of trees several times a year, individually making measurements on them. So about 5 years or so ago, we actually had a small project to start thinking about how we might do these kind of measurements. And so we basically undertook a desktop study of potential methods for analysing carbohydrates within avocado tissues. And I'll come back to this a little bit later. But effectively what we found when we looked at all the potential methods that we could sort of find in the literature or think of was that near-infrared reflectance spectroscopy was the most likely one to be useful in the field. So I just want to take a couple of minutes to sort of talk about why that is and roughly how it works, because it's often easy to, these kind of methods get presented almost as magic black boxes, but the reality is there's physics and chemistry that underlie them, and they limit what is and isn't possible. So if we think about the wet lab assays, putting aside mass spectrometry, the majority of assays actually use some form of light, energy, radiation, and have that pointed at a sample of some sort, often a purified one, and then look for a change in the absorbance or a change in the colour or whatever it may be. So again, the formatting's jumped around a bit. Probably should have done this as a PDF. So really what's going on, whether it's a purified sample or even if, in our case, if we're doing an in-field measurement, we're going to be using intact tissues, is that, we shine shining light or energy, radiation of some sort at this sample. Some of it's absorbed by the sample. This is depending on the chemistry of that sample. If it's an intact leaf, obviously it's quite complicated chemistry that's there versus a purified sample where it's quite simple. Some of it goes through and some of it is reflected off. What goes through, what's reflected off is what's not absorbed, and both of those are reflective of the chemistry that's actually in that sample. So in the lab, we'll often do a transmission. We detect it here. In the field, particularly if we want an on-the-go sensor that's going past, not physically touching that sample potentially, it's easier to look at this reflectance spectra here. So the light that's reflected off and detect that this way. And so that's basically where we come to the reflectance spectroscopy aspect of it. So in the field, obviously, it could be we're actually shining some form of light or radiation at it, or we could be using natural radiation from the sun. So, as you're aware, when we look at the, it is blurring, when we look at the electromagnetic spectrum, the visible light is only a small part of that, and the energy that's encompassed within the light, depends on the wavelength of that, and high at this end, lower at that end. So this is the spectrum, a spectrum from avocado leaf, and so we've got the edge of the visible here, sort of orange-red, and through into the near-infrared, which we can't see. And so you see we've got a shape of this here. This is a reflectance spectrum from the leaf. There's a couple of very obvious big features. So we've got chlorophyll here, so we've got very low reflectance because nearly all of the light there is absorbed by chlorophyll. And another one here in the near infrared, we've got lower reflectance because that's being absorbed by the water in the leaf. So that spectral shape gives us information on that chemistry. If we're interested in carbohydrates, as the name implies, carbohydrates are made of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. So it's hydrated carbon, water and carbon. And doesn't matter that we can't see these properly, but there's a lots of these. Along the bottom here is the wavelength. So again, we're here basically at red here and into the near infrared and the shortwave infrared along the bottom. We get absorbance by different chemical bonds, some of these which are within the carbohydrates we're interested in, and so they're specific to different wavelengths because of the energies of the light that are absorbed. At this end, we've got sort of more fundamental absorbance, and then here we get harmonics or overtones, and it's a bit like in music. If any of you do a lot of do music, you know about harmonics and so on, and so you get multiple frequencies from a single note in effect that are related back to that one. But as we go down this way towards the red and the visible, because we're into second, third harmonics, basically the sensitivity of detection is reduced. It's much smaller effect. So from a, ideally we want to be at this end of the spectrum. So we don't want to be down at the light visible end. We want to be as far as we can into the infrared. The tricky thing is that down at this end of the spectrum, the sensors are really expensive. So a basic line scan here would cost like $250,000 plus, and because of the physics involved, and the physics and materials people tell me, it's not my area, but that it's not likely that they're going to become particularly cheap in the near future. So we've got to compromise in terms of where we're working. The other thing, which again I'll show a figure later on, is there's not a lot of sunlight down here either. So down here we've got very low sensitivity. So what we suggest is this area here in the near infrared is the best way to go. So that's in terms of the I guess the technology, the sensing method, and why we think that that's the the appropriate way to take. But obviously we need to get from using a sensor and using that method through to an action for the grower. So that spectrum that we get from the sensor itself needs to be, first of all, we need to be able to accurately estimate carbohydrates from it. And there's a bunch of different ways we can do that. Most of them come under the machine learning label, or AI, if you want to call it that. And the simplest of these are effectively multivariate regressions, where we look at all the different wave bands that we've got and the intensity of those. We can also use neural networks, so like CNN. So almost everything anyone ever tells you about as being AI is actually a convolutional neural network at the back of it, including the large language models that are popular at the moment. But typically we don't need to. We can use simpler versions for that. But there's a whole range of ways of working with that spectral data and turning it into carbohydrate estimates. But they all depend on having ground truth wet lab data to back them up. So we have to do that at quite a big scale, which obviously makes the cost of doing this higher. So the intent then is to actually develop that method to go back to this, to get this carbohydrate information, and then to map that out. So basically you've got a map for your block or for your farm, and so you can see areas of high or low carbohydrates and manage those accordingly. Obviously, as we've heard from Harley and others, we're still, I guess, working out the most appropriate mechanisms to do that, and so hopefully this project will lead into that a bit. So I mentioned earlier on we had a project a few years ago, AV19006, to basically, I guess, first of all do that desktop study I talked about, but also to just prove in the lab setting that it had the potential to do that. So we've got an active sensor here in the lab where we're shining both visible and infrared light onto a sample, and we get the spectra. So I showed you that spectra before. That's a pixel here, different ways of sort of combining the spectra. And here we've built a very quick and simple model using random forest, I think it was, where we can predict what the starch level is from the spectral information, and then we've actually gone and measured what the starch level in that sample was. And obviously this was a quick and dirty. We haven't got a huge number of samples there, but you can see that we're already towards a reasonable relationship there. So for those of you that are interested, I think the R-squared of this was about 0.85 or something like that. So that's an example where, you know, to demonstrate that the approach we're taking has the potential to work. So to go out into the field, we need to do this on a much larger scale, clearly, and we want to assess whole trees, like I said. So there's a couple of things here. Firstly, in that lab, you know, we had a known light shining on that. In the field, at scale, and we're basically planning to use a UAV-based system with a camera on it here, such as this. But we're now reliant on sunlight. So I mentioned earlier on that when you're at this more useful end of the spectrum, not only are the sensors expensive, but as you can see, there's very little sunlight there as well. So we're basically looking at the region from here to here. So we've got gaps in there due to atmospheric absorption. So we have to deal with the atmospheric effects in terms of our data. And we also have to collect enough and accurate enough ground truth samples to be able to match with the pixels of information that we see from the UAV. One other advantage of this, though, is if we get this working nicely, we're just starting to see hyperspectral satellites go up into the sky. So unlike if we use our own light source, going from this to a satellite view, which would give you whole, you know, region information as well as per farm or per block information, will be a much easier translation. We're probably 5 to 10 years away from having those satellites all up there and easily available, but the research ones are starting to go up, and there is a commercial provider starting to put first ones up as well. So it'll be something we see in the future. Okay, so I did want to give, you know, one example of where we've taken this kind of approach in viticulture and where we were interested in fruit composition. So we looked at various factors of fruit composition, and we did a lot of work in the lab, and then we went out into the field. So in this case, we did continue to use an active sensor because with the viticulture, the fruit are often obscured. They're low in the canopy. You're not going to see them from above. So we've got to physically get out in the fields. So we used a lighting source here. So we were on the go using a point spectrometer approach. This is taking some individual, this is a reference for taking individual bunches to use as a ground truth sample and use as ground truth for the method. Well, basically we went out and drove this gear down the row. Then we selected out, used a model to select out which spectra were fruit rather than leaves and so on, and then used a lab calibration we built around various fruit parameters. So what we've got here then, this is 10 rows that we scanned with the system in a commercial vineyard, and we've used one of our prime measures, which is around bome, which is the amount of sugar, so it's the amount of carbohydrates that are in the berry and fruit. And the idea is that, you know, this tells you where they are in terms of maturation ready for winemaking. So with this information, you can plan how you're going to do your harvest and when you're going to do your harvest. And when we showed the map that we did here to the growers, they were quite interested because this patch here is where they've got extra moisture in the soil. I think it's slightly lower there, so they get higher vigor, which in turn leads to lower fruit maturity. So we were picking up with that, something that they kind of understood as an impact in the field there. So I've talked a lot about the methods and so on because it's the big focus of this, but we, you know, as I said at the beginning with the objectives, we will continue to, I guess, try and develop that understanding about how carbohydrate status is related. Not at that very detailed level that Harley's doing, but at the tree level. So together with Queensland DPI at Bundaberg, we've got some trials there that we'll use for some of our sampling and some of our UAV flights and so on. And there's a couple of focuses there with the trials. So one is to very carefully look at the carbohydrates of all the parts of the tree as you go through the season and through the phenology and the relationship with yield there. And the other one is to directly manipulate carbohydrates. One of the ways to do that is via shading, so that you reduce the photosynthesis and reduce the carbohydrates available, and to track the effects of that on the plants. So that will be, yeah, continuing on with Queensland DPI there. So just to finish up as a summary, I guess first of all I sort of talked about you know, using AI. So we haven't got any pictures yet flying our drones through the avocados. So I went to a co-pilot and had it make some up. So hopefully next time I'm talking to people, we've got real pictures of drones flying over avocado orchards. Yes, but in summary, the project will develop a prototype method for tree carbohydrate status, and that's based on near-infrared reflected spectroscopy, which we will do via UAV. We will develop a standardized manual tree sampling method for the wet lab analysis, which needs to underpin that and could also be used, obviously, in other projects as well subsequently. And we'll be undertaking field trials where we'll be manipulating tree carbohydrate status to improve our understanding of these relationships, which will hopefully, together with a measurement method, lead to new ideas and more accurate ways of managing the carbohydrates in those trees. And that is it. Thank you.